Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ralph Casa from the Pacific Forum, CSIS. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here in Washington, D.C. rather than in Honolulu this morning. We've been having a cold spell there. The temperature this morning was actually down in the low 20s, but fortunately that was centigrade. So, but I think it's delighted to see so many people here. I have been privileged to be a part of this project that Bonnie has been running for the last 2 years, and this is the second volume. I hope many of you have seen the first volume as well on cross-strait CBMs. The time, I believe, has never been better to move forward on cross-strait CBMs. There is a growing confidence on both sides, a growing willingness to talk, still a lot of suspicions and a lot of apprehensions. One of the things this project has been trying to do over the past couple of years is better identify the roadblocks to cooperation, to sort of not just act as a facilitator, but also to try to solve some of the problems and provide new ideas. I would say there was a sea change in attitude difference between 2008 and 2009, but I don't think we're at a point where anyone should be overconfident. In my view, there's still a lot of concerns, a lot of suspicions, a lot of additional work that needs to be done. And the opportunity, I think, for miscalculation, for accidents that could get out of control are still very high. So in my view, the time has never been better. The two sides have never been more willing, and this is really the time to move forward. I commend Bonnie for her activities in two regards. She's also brought this renegade outfit on this small island called Pacific Forum here to our parent on the mainland, CSIS, just to sort of provide an example for how the mainland and Taiwan can also cooperate. So at this point, let me turn things over to Bonnie, please.
Great analogy, Ralph. Thanks very much, and thank you all for coming. The delegation that CSIS took to Taiwan and to the mainland to talk about CBMs last year went in late August, early September. And of course, there have been many things that have transpired since then. What I've really tried to do in this report is lay out the current situation in cross-strait relations and talk about the prospects for CBMs and examine the perspectives on both sides of the strait. To look at how both sides see the possible preconditions for CBMs, what kind of CBM agenda they might seek to pursue, and also what objectives they would seek to achieve respectively in implementing CBMs. And not surprisingly, there is some overlap between the two sides of the strait, but there's also significant differences. What we've seen, of course, since Ma Ying-jeou has come to power as president of Taiwan about 20 months ago, is really a significant improvement in the cross-strait relationship. Direct flights have commenced and 12 agreements have been signed on functional matters. There's a diplomatic truce that's essentially in place, albeit informal and only tacitly accepted by China. And Beijing removed its opposition to Taiwan becoming an observer at the WHA meeting in 2009. And that was a good, I would say small, but good first step toward welcoming Taiwan as a participant in the international community. Now, clearly the dispute over sovereignty remains, but it is to some extent in the background, at least for now. Both sides have agreed to shelve their differences on political matters and to seek to cooperate where common ground exists. The basis for this cooperation is, of course, the 1992 consensus, which enables both sides to recognize the existence of one China, but call that one China or define it the way that they respectively define it. Now, the leaders on both sides of the strait, Ma Ying-jeou on Taiwan and Hu Jintao on the mainland, have set out important long-term goals. They have both stated that they support the eventual signing of a peace accord, an agreement on ending hostilities across the strait, and the establishment of a military confidence-building mechanism. Now, none of these topics are yet on the formal negotiating agenda between the two sides, and both sides really do judge it as premature to engage in official discussions on these topics yet. There's no clear roadmap on how to even proceed toward these long-term goals. And indeed, I would say there's really no agreement on the definitions or even the sequencing of these eventual objectives, either within Taiwan and within the mainland or as well as between them. But it does seem logical, at least to me, that confidence-building measures would come first. Greater trust and confidence is needed, I think, as a precursor to negotiating more complex agreements. Now, CBMs can be broadly defined as formal and informal measures that address, prevent, or resolve uncertainties between parties. Now, usually, in the Western experience, I would say the majority of the time, CBMs have been implemented between sovereign states, but there are ample examples where CBMs have been implemented between non-sovereign parties, and one example that I would cite would be the PLO's CBMs with Israel. And when I led the delegation in 2008, both to Taiwan and the mainland, we talked about CBMs not just in the military sphere, but also in non-traditional areas, CBMs, for example, in health and environmental areas. And since then, probably unrelated to our visit, there has been some headway, I would say, in cooperation between the two sides of the strait on non-traditional security areas. And one that I would cite that I think was rather significant was a search and rescue exercise that was held between the two sides of the strait in October 2008, the picture of which is on the cover of my report. And that simulated a fire on one of the three mini-links, the Xiaosantong boats that ferries passengers back and forth from Xiamen to Jinmen. No military units involved, but nevertheless, I think, a good example of cooperation in maritime safety. So this past August and early September, when we went back to Taiwan and the mainland, we really focused exclusively on military CBMs. In the Western experience, military CBMs have been steps that increase the predictability of military actions and therefore reduce the risks of miscalculation or accidents. Now, some initial unilateral steps have been taken by both sides, and so I would argue that the process of establishing cross-strait military CBMs is really already underway. There have not been negotiated agreements, but there are some important moves that both sides have taken, and these actually go back many years, and I discuss some of these in my report. For example, Taiwan publicly announces its military exercise annually, declares that it will not fire the first shot, and more recently, last year, employed a disaster relief scenario for the 2009 Hanguang exercise rather than focusing on a scenario of attack from the mainland. The PRC, for its part, has also made unilateral gestures. For example, last year, an exercise was moved out of the Nanjing military region a bit farther from Taiwan's shores. So why are military CBMs desirable? First, as I mentioned, they can reduce the risk of an unintended accident. Fighters from both sides of the strait do seek to avoid each other, as do ships, but I would argue that the danger of collision still exists, and there are steps that both sides can take to ensure that that does not occur. It's also important to create channels of communication so that if an accident occurs or some kind of a crisis, that escalation can be controlled. There can be means by which the two sides can quickly get in touch with each other to clarify the situation. I would also say that it's important to nurture some relationship between the two militaries. After all, we've seen businessmen and athletes, scholars from both sides of the Strait getting to know each other after having been separated for so many years. And the two militaries are completely estranged, have had no contact for 60 years. And I would say from my conversations with militaries on both sides of the Strait that they have very limited understanding of each other. So I think that would be useful. And then finally, looking out longer term, I think military CBMs can create a basis for Taiwan to participate in multilateral military exercise activities, which of course it is barred from doing at the moment. But if once there are perhaps cross-strait CBMs, perhaps the mainland would welcome Taiwan's participation in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief type exercises. Just as Taiwan hopes after the signing of the cross-strait economic agreement to have free trade type agreements with other countries. So what are the obstacles? And here is where I want to talk a little bit about the perspectives on both sides of the Strait and where there really are some differences. The first question that I'd like to address is the time right for CBMs right now? Are the two sides ready to negotiate? And clearly, from Taiwan's perspective, the answer is no. Taiwan officials and scholars argue that there is a lack of a domestic consensus on Taiwan, that engaging in negotiations on military CBMs prematurely could even put in jeopardy the progress that has been made so far in improving relations across the Strait. So they argue this is something that should not be entered into until the citizens in Taiwan are well prepared. They have learned, I think, some lessons from the cross-strait economic framework agreement that they are trying to negotiate that has engendered some concern, opposition internally. And I think people in Taiwan, particularly the ruling government, also fears that entering into these discussions prematurely would provide the opposition, the DPP, with more ammunition to further accuse Ma of compromising sovereignty and betraying the country. Taiwan also argues that China should not pressure Taiwan to engage in these talks before it is ready. And they do perceive that there is growing pressure from the mainland to talk about politically sensitive issues and to talk about military CBMs. And the sense in Taiwan is that this is an outgrowth of Beijing's sense of its own rising power and its growing confidence. There's also a perception in Taiwan that Beijing believes that it's already responded positively to Taiwan's demand for dignity and greater international space, and that therefore now it is time for Taiwan to take more steps to address Beijing's concerns. And so these are some of the concerns that Taiwan has, arguing that the time, again, is not right. China, however, believes that efforts should be made to take full advantage of what they refer to as the period of strategic opportunity period, not just in the global international situation, but also in cross-strait relations. And that talks should start informally between scholars who are authorized by their governments to probe both sides to see what the possibilities are to agree on a CBM agenda. And one of the reasons why there's growing impatience on the mainland is because there is concern about Ma Ying-jeou's persistent low ratings in public opinion polls and the possibility that the DPP can return to power. So there is some growing urgency to get something accomplished in the near term, to make more progress, and to convince the people on Taiwan that there are more benefits from the cross-strait relationship, not just economically, but also in other spheres. There's also, I would say, a widely held belief that if discussion on political and military issues is postponed too long, that this could result in obstacles to further cooperation, even in the economic sphere. The second question that we discussed on both sides of the Strait was whether there should be preconditions for CBM negotiations. And here, I think we found profound differences between the two sides. Taiwan argues, particularly President Ma Ying-jeou argues, that the missiles that China has deployed opposite Taiwan should be removed before the signing of a peace accord. And he has generally stated that CBMs would be part of a peace accord, not something that would occur before, although there are some officials who hold different views, and I don't think that is necessarily set in stone. There are also arguments on Taiwan that China should renounce its intention to use force and modify the anti-secession law that was passed by the National People's Congress in 2005. That has not been stated as a formal position, but that is a widely held view. Now, of course, from the Chinese side, there is an official view that is enunciated by officials as well as scholars that any adjustments in military deployments should be reciprocal and should be a subject for bilateral discussion, not a precondition. The Chinese argue that without political assurances from Taiwan that it will forego de jure independence, that they cannot take steps to reduce China's military buildup. And some Chinese assert that a unilateral drawdown of missiles would have the appearance of acting under pressure from Taiwan. And they say that making unwarranted concessions could engender domestic criticism of the leadership on the mainland. Some in China also call for Taiwan to accept Beijing's One China principle as a precondition for engaging in talks on CBMs. Again, not a formal official position, but it is widely discussed both in the media and in private conversations. I think this is a non-starter, certainly from what we have heard on Taiwan. For Taiwan, the 1992 consensus would have to be sufficient for engaging in discussions on CBMs. There is not likely to be any progress toward acceptance of the One China principle. Now, there's also a discussion about, it's a little bit different than preconditions, but creating conditions. How should the appropriate conditions be created so that both sides can be more amenable to engaging in these negotiations? And Taiwan thinks that there's more that the mainland can do in addition to pulling back or destroying its missiles to create conditions for beginning informal discussions of CBMs. For example, Taiwan military officers suggest that the mainland refrain from obstructing military personnel from engaging in international military security fora, in dialogues, and conferences organized by non-governmental organizations. And they also hope that the mainland will follow Taiwan's practice of announcing its exercises in advance, the size, the scopes, the date, and the location. Again, Taiwan also believes that there should be no linkage between military CBMs and Taiwan's arms purchases from the United States. And there certainly are people on the mainland who would like to link the two together and would like to see that arms sales from the U.S. slow and eventually come to an end. This is something of great concern to Taiwan. Taiwan believes if it enters into negotiations that even if the mainland does not set this out as a precondition, that it will use the fact that these discussions are taking place, that there's improvement in ties and military relations between the two sides of the Strait, to argue that these arms sales to Taiwan are no longer necessary. So this is a concern on the Taiwan side. Finally, on the Chinese side, there is concern that CBMs not be used to legitimize the existence of Taiwan as a separate sovereign state. And again, as I said at the outset, CBMs are not necessarily limited to sovereign states, but China believes that Taiwan could use a CBM process between the two sides to strengthen its de facto independence. Finally, the last question that I want to talk about is what should be the primary objectives of CBMs? And here again, there's some overlap, but there's also, I think, important differences. Taiwan, from a broad perspective, views military CBMs as aimed at securing a stable status quo between the two sides of the strait. Taiwan seeks to preserve the status quo. The vast majority of people on Taiwan prefer that the status quo be preserved. And CBMs can be a means of further stabilizing that status quo. Now, many people on the mainland talk about CBMs as part of China's agenda to promote reunification. But even more importantly, they point out that CBMs should not be aimed at perpetuating the status quo indefinitely. And there's one individual who's a military officer who's warned against, publicly, warned against the peaceful separation of the two sides of the strait. And he's from the Academy of Military Sciences. He sees, and I think some others in the Chinese military see, the possibility that CBMs could be used by Taiwan to promote the separation of the two sides. I would, looking at the issue more tactically, one of Taiwan's principal objectives in negotiating CBMs is to reduce the risk of accident that could escalate to unintended conflict, as I talked about earlier. And this concern is reflected in the 2009 National Defense Report, which states that the probability of military friction is rather high. Should there be a lack of mutual trust on both sides, any mishaps or accidents will be misinterpreted as deliberate provocation and further result in full-scale military conflict. That's a quote from the most recent Taiwan National Defense White Paper. The Chinese, I think, would say that preventing accidental conflict is a secondary order objective, and the primary goal is to build mutual trust and to promote camaraderie and understanding between the two militaries. Military experts in China talk about discussing shared military culture, Swin's Art of War, for example, discussing the experiences that the two militaries shared fighting against the Japanese in the 1930s and 40s, and how to defend common claims in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea. These are the kinds of topics that we heard from the Chinese that they would be interested in discussing as part of a CBM process. The implications, of course, for the United States, for the rest of the region, I think are very important to examine. And in the report, I have a short discussion of what the U.S. role should be in cross-strait CBMs, which I see as rather limited, encouraging, but not pressing an agenda, and certainly not pushing both sides to do anything that they are not ready to do, especially Taiwan. There is also a suggestion, a section on policy recommendations for all three sides at the end of the report, but rather talk about that, which you can read by yourselves. I thought that we would ask Mike Green to give his perspective on this issue and the implications of the evolving cross-strait relationship and the potential for engaging in military CBMs discussions between the two sides. So.
Well, thank you, and I want to congratulate Bonnie and Ralph on this report. It's one more example of what Bonnie does so well, which is really testing propositions on both sides of the strait. Of course, it's also interesting because it's an analytical piece, but in a way, it is part of this whole process. It contributes to this process of trying to build confidence and explore options towards the future. I was on the NSC staff for 5 years, worked on this issue, among others. Of course, I'm not an official now. I only play one on TV. But I will try to give a perspective on what I imagine a U.S. government view would be on cross-straits confidence-building measures in the years to come. As Bonnie pointed out, there's a steady, measured, fairly slow pace to this process, but it's conceivable in the coming years that there could be very quick movement on some of the recommendations that are in this report. So it's worth considering what the U.S. perspective might be. I thought I'd talk about the broad parameters of how the U.S. would approach this issue, and then react to some of the specific recommendations for CBMs in the report, again, as a U.S. government official might view them in future, and then explore a bit more what roles the U.S. could play beyond the recommendations in the report on the U.S. It's worth stating at the beginning, and Bonnie and Ralph have this in the report, that there's consistent and bipartisan and public support for cross-straits confidence-building measures. The report quotes Kurt Campbell from the Clinton administration, encouraging and supporting these efforts and noting their importance. Jim Kelly, Assistant Secretary under George Bush, and most recently Jim Steinberg, all with fairly similar approaches, arguing that that the U.S. would be supportive of cross-straits confidence-building measures. And it makes sense from the perspective of U.S. interests. These kinds of CBMs are consistent with the U.S. Interest in a peaceful resolution of issues across the straits, consistent with the U.S. interest in finding a variety of ways to have greater transparency in PLA, modernization and operations, and also a genuine U.S. concern about avoiding accidental conflict that could undermine security and stability in the region. As Bonnie points out in the report, the rules of engagement for both the ROC, Air Force and Navy, and their PLA counterparts have thus far been careful to prevent the kind of close interaction that would lead to accidental conflict, but it's a dynamic situation with a changing order of battle and new technologies. So the U.S. would clearly have an interest in steps taken by both sides to avoid any possible accidents. It was interesting to me that the delegation found in the PRC almost no interest in an active U.S. role in cross-straits CBMs, but in Taiwan, considerable interest in the U.S. playing some role to oversee, to guarantee, to help add leverage. The report notes at the end, very briefly, that the U.S. role would be constrained. The U.S. would not broker or likely participate in directly in negotiations. And the report has three basic recommendations for the U.S., which make a lot of sense. First, encourage cross-strait CBMs. Second, maintain a consistent U.S. message on Taiwan policy. And third, I think related to that, no changes, no unilateral changes in the U.S. approach on this issue or on cross-straits. In other words, be a steadying hand behind the scenes. I think it's possible to go beyond that, and especially now that I'm not in government, and speculate a bit more about what role the U.S. might play. Before doing that, it's worth reminding everyone the parameters within which I think any U.S. government now or in the future would approach this. The first, which I think probably 70% of this room has memorized, but I'll restate it anyway, would be the 6 assurances, which have a direct bearing on this. First, that the U.S. would not set a date for ending arms sales to the ROC. Second, the U.S. would not hold prior consultations with Beijing on arms sales to the ROC. Third, and in this case probably most important, the U.S. would not play a mediating role between the PRC and the ROC. Fourth, the U.S. will not revise the Taiwan Relations Act. Fifth, the U.S. will not alter its position on the question of Taiwan. And sixth, the U.S. will not pressure Taiwan to enter into negotiations with the PRC. Those 6 assurances, I think, probably informed the delegation's recommendations on how the U.S. should approach CBMs. If we imagine that cross-strait CBMs could pick up some more momentum in the future, I think there are some other considerations that at least in an unstated way would guide U.S. thinking about cross-straits confidence building. First, I think the U.S. would have an interest in ensuring that Taiwan did not negotiate an imbalance in forces or make permanent the growing delta, the growing gap in capabilities, or in any way take steps through CBMs that would undermine Taiwan's capabilities or readiness to dissuade or deter the PRC side from using force. No one's proposing that, but I think that would be, as CBMs moved forward, something the U.S. officials would watch. In addition, I think the U.S. would want to watch carefully to ensure that any CBMs did not have any detrimental impact on other U.S. security equities in the region beyond Taiwan. Specifically, I'm thinking of Articles 5 and 6 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, the defense of Japan and the stability of the Far East, and the longstanding U.S. interest in ensuring freedom of navigation. So these are things that would be watched. And so overall, I think that in terms of process, there would be a keen U.S. interest in close consultation and transparency between Taipei and Washington as these CBMs move forward, if they do. And Bonnie makes that point very well in the report. In terms of the specific recommendations, again, from one U.S. perspective, the report talks about near-term steps, or near-term CBM proposals that include white papers, more information on military exercises, perhaps expanding Beijing's pledge on WMD with respect to the cross-strait situation, perhaps modest cuts in forces or realignment ideas. I think all of these would be generally in U.S. interests and would be supported. In some ways, I would think because of the U.S. interest in avoiding accidents, there may be a perspective in Washington that some of these CBMs aimed at avoiding accidents don't necessarily have to wait for larger political developments. But I don't think any U.S. administration would press Taiwan to pursue CBMs before there's a domestic consensus to do so. But that said, I do think that some of these things designed at preventing accidents have a merit above and beyond the politics. One of the near-term CBM proposals that caught my eye that I think raised a yellow card, if not a red card, if I may, was the proposal to modify exercises. The report suggests that perhaps as a near-term CBM, the ROC could focus more on exercises related to humanitarian relief operations, search and rescue operations other than war. That jumped out at me as potentially problematic because it seems to me in order to enhance the ROC's ability to dissuade and deter the use of force, a lot of what Taiwan has to do is not in the hardware category or the arms procurement category. It's in what you might call the software category. In other words, correcting problems in interoperability, sustainability, readiness, things that have to be exercised so that the different branches of the ROC military are making up for gaps that have been there for a long time. And I would be more cautious about putting in place an exercise regime in Taiwan that would make it more difficult for Taiwan to address some of these shortcomings that are necessary to have effective deterrence and dissuasion. So I'll be interested in Bonnie's reaction to that, but that jumped out at me. The report also talks about what it calls more advanced measures, things that are a bit more ambitious, including hotlines. I think that's an excellent proposal. We should be realistic. The U.S. has found that hotlines with the PRC are of limited utility. Often in a crisis, the PRC side doesn't want to pick up the phone. So it's a nice tool to have, but it's not the silver bullet sometimes people would expect. It's a bit more symbolic in some ways. Military exchanges, of course, an excellent proposal. I think from a U.S. perspective, there would be some interest in ensuring protection of sensitive information to the extent that senior military officers are increasing exchanges across the straits. The U.S. would want to make sure that it has some understanding of what issues are being discussed and that sensitive operational discussions or intel sharing or other things are not on the table. Including the military in the CEF-ARETS talks is a good idea. Maritime cooperation is good. As this picture shows, I think maritime cooperation, and this is true for Japan's experience and others in Asia, is easier if you start with the Coast Guard. The Navy, in some ways, is the last service at sea if you want to start working your way towards confidence building on these issues. Nothing against the Navy, but the Coast Guard is seen as at least half civilian and a bit easier politically to get these things started. Risk reduction agreements are good, also, as long as they don't, as I say, impinge on rules of engagement or otherwise get in the way of readiness. One of the suggestions that the delegation heard strongly in Taipei was that a missile pullback would be an important move by the PRC, and I think that's absolutely right. I would caution on that one that we need to distinguish between symbolism and substance, between gestures and real threat reduction. I was in the NSC when President Jiang Zemin proposed a vague idea for a missile pullback to President Bush in 2002. Randy Shriver and others, and I and others pursued this subsequently, a few years later, to try to see if there was some more there. And my impression was that this was a Ministry of Foreign Affairs idea that was put in President Jiang's briefing book, and it was something of a unique victory for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and an end run around the PLA. Designed primarily with the hope that there would be some halt to Taiwan arms sales. Missile pullback's a good gesture, but we need to be distinguishing threat reduction from gestures because, of course, missiles, especially solid fuel missiles, can move very easily. Now, what other roles can the U.S. play beyond being encouraging and not causing trouble or not forcing or pressing Taiwan to negotiate? Well, one category would be, I think, what's sometimes called intellectual facilitation. The U.S. government has a history of helping cross-straits dialogue by engaging in our own separate dialogues with both Beijing and Taipei to help clarify concepts, nomenclature, and generally contribute to a more trusting attitude, but not brokering, negotiating, or pushing compromises. The U.S. Embassy in Beijing and AIT in Taipei were quite active in the 2000, 2001, 2002 timeframe, actively discussing with their respective host governments what their views were and sharing their understandings, because AIT and Embassy Beijing were very dynamically sharing their perspectives with each other, and that helped in some ways contribute. In the 2004-2005 timeframe, there was, I think, quite active efforts also to do the same. So there is a precedent for the U.S. playing this intellectual facilitation role. In some ways, think tanks and second-track dialogues can be most productive because they're least encumbered by things like the Six Assurances and the official moniker. This report itself, I think, is an example of how second-track dialogue can contribute to this intellectual facilitation. And I think the intellectual facilitation role could be important because, as Bonnie points out, the PRC's definition of transparency and confidence building is quite different from Taiwan's. The PLA, I think, still largely views transparency as contrary to the doctrine of dissuasion and intimidation and leverage. So there's a fundamental difference in views of what transparency means and whether it's good or bad. And the PLA or the PRC side views these CBMs as things that flow from political decisions, whereas the U.S., I think, has experience working, including with China, on CBMs that are good for conflict avoidance and accident avoidance. So in terms of intellectually preparing and contributing to more understanding of Taiwan's position in Beijing, I think the U.S. and think tanks in particular can play an important intellectual facilitation role. Also, along those lines, I think many of the CBMs in the report focus on what I would consider 20th century security challenges. But in the 21st century, in the area of transformation or revolution in military affairs, there are a lot more areas of contact between nations and militaries that are a lot more complicated, including outer space and cyberspace. These are going to be extremely challenging even for the U.S. to discuss with the PRC, and exponentially more challenging for Taiwan to discuss with the PRC, particularly things like cyberspace, outer space, nuclear doctrine. So to the extent the U.S. is actively engaging and attempting to begin these discussions and reduce the chance of accidental conflict in these new cyber and outer space areas, I think it can contribute and help to Taiwan. And perhaps it may be necessary for the U.S. to get some of these CBM issues because it's too hard to cross the straits directly. Finally, and very importantly, and two more in terms of the U.S. role, the U.S. has a very critical role in providing support and leverage for Taiwan's position. In my view, Beijing would be very satisfied with an outcome where some symbolic CBMs lead to a peace and framework agreement that is predicated on an end to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan or otherwise constraining Taiwan's defense. And if you think about the situation dynamically, not just statically, the military imbalance is growing. It is growing to Beijing's advantage. In this environment, there may be a temptation in Beijing to not push meaningful CBMs on itself, but rather to go through symbolic gestures and watch Taiwan's strategic situation get more and more, and military situation get more and more problematic, and then use the CBM process to try to lock that vulnerability in with an end to U.S. arms sales or constraints on Taiwan's readiness and interoperability and sustainability. So from Beijing's perspective, being very cynical about it, there's an advantage to very superficial CBMs that prolong a trend that is to Beijing's advantage. And I think the U.S. has a really important role to play to demonstrate to Beijing that absent substantive threat reduction from the Chinese side, this is not a trend that will continue moving in a secular way to Beijing's advantage. And for that reason, the most recent arms sales package from Washington is very helpful to this process and cross-straits generally. And in my view, F-16 CDs sometime this year will also be very important. And it's not just about arms sales. I think high-level visits, working beyond TIFA to more substantive trade understandings, cabinet-level visits, and so forth, really are all part of a critical background role the U.S. can play to ensure that Taiwan is going into this from a position of confidence and strength. I don't think there are very many historical examples of two sides, whether you argue they're sovereign or not, but of two sides entering into threat reduction negotiations where one side is confident that time is on its side and the other side's situation is degrading. So if the U.S. wants substance out of this, I think we have an important role, not just on CBMs, but generally on cross-straits, backing up Taiwan. And President Ma has been quite articulate about this point himself in his was it March broadcast or VTR with CSIS and other statements. Finally, the U.S. has an important role to play in what I would call an analytical support role. You know, if we move from CBMs to more substantive threat reductions, verification, monitoring, analysis will be really very important. And the capacity of Taiwan to do this will be limited. And I think the U.S. can play an important role in helping ensure and give the Taiwan side confidence that CBMs are verifiable, when appropriate, irreversible, that they contribute to security, and the U.S. With analytical support and cooperation can help determine what is a gesture, what is substantive threat reduction. For all of this to work, as I said earlier, and as Bonnie points out in the report, there's going to have to be a very trusting and transparent dialogue between Taipei and Washington. I think that's the case right now, but this could become a much more fluid and dynamic situation. This is really important for three reasons. First, because the U.S. has real equities, as I mentioned earlier, and it's in Taipei's interest to make sure that U.S. equities in broader security in the Asia-Pacific region are being reinforced and not in any way intended or otherwise undermined. Secondly, it's really critical to this process. One of the key findings here is that Taipei has a challenge maintaining domestic consensus for this process. And nothing would undermine consensus in Taiwan more than one part of the U.S. government saying they're unhappy with some aspect of cross-strait CBMs. And this happens, believe me, it happened on my watch. Sometimes when I was in the NSC, we'd have this carefully crafted, tightly held, confidential discussion with Tokyo or Taipei, and we wouldn't tell DOD. Why would you? Just kidding. But we tell the Nelson report, of course. But every once in a while, often at the request, frankly, not of the White House or the State Department or DOD, but of the other government, they'll tell the NSC or State or DOD and say, got to keep this really tight. Don't tell anyone. And then when it comes out, another part of the U.S. government says this is outrageous. When Koizumi went to Pyongyang in 2002, the Conte, the PM's office, asked us to keep it very tightly held. So when it came out as a big surprise, some parts of the U.S. government said this is outrageous. It's an example of why you need this kind of transparency, in part so that the U.S. government is ready when there are moves on CBMs to come out with a unified position of support and not exacerbate internal tensions within Taiwan. And finally, the U.S. can play a really critical role if it's understanding the process in building up not only leverage on Beijing through arms sales and so forth, but also building international support for CBMs, locking them in, making it hard for Beijing to reverse itself, and keeping some healthy pressure on Beijing to be more forthcoming. And I think more than any other relationship, Taipei's relationship with Washington is important for making sure the international community is backing up this process in a way that's helpful for Taiwan's security and cross-strait stability. So those are some musings beyond the report's excellent recommendations on what the U.S. might do, and I'd be interested in questions and Bonnie and Ralph's reactions.
Mike, thank you very much. I'd like to make just two very quick observations, and then I'm going to give Bonnie an opportunity to quickly respond to what she's heard so far, and then we will open it up for questions. My two observations. Number one, to say the U.S. should support cross-strait CBMs sounds like sort of a no-brainer and apple pie and motherhood, but it really is an important recommendation. I mean, the one thing that came true to me in both the mainland and in Taiwan is that there is an element, I'd say it's still a minority, but it's a strong minority that either believes that the U.S. is not in favor of improved cross-strait relations, or finds it a very convenient argument to say that they believe that the U.S. is not in favor of cross-strait arguments for their own domestic political purposes. And I'm not just talking about in Taiwan. The same thing holds true on the mainland. One of the things that struck me was the number of Chinese that told us that one of the things the U.S. needed to do was be more supportive of Ma Ying-jeou. I don't think you would have heard that from the Chinese about previous Taiwan leaders, but really a concern that the U.S. Needed to be very clear in its support for cross-strait, because there was elements, not only in Taiwan, but also on the mainland, that were playing this card about the U.S. wanting to keep the two apart. So I think that that's an important point. The second thing that I noticed in my own visits to Beijing, and during 2009, I had either the pleasure or misfortune of having gone to China 5 times. And I would say as Ma's popularity went down, and it did during the course of the year, and particularly after the typhoon, China's belief that time was on its side. The thing that we heard in the beginning of the year was, well, there are certain things we'll do now, and then certain things we'll do during Ma's second term. No one in Beijing talks about Ma's second term now. What they talk about is the need to sort of consolidate what's been done. So I think that there is sort of a growing concern that in Beijing that time really may not be on its side in this process, and that's where the phrase peaceful separation comes in, where they feel that if we sort of continue in the rate that we're going, us giving, Taiwan taking, that it's just going to make the real status quo. The Chinese won't say that the status quo is that the two are separate, but in fact that is the case, and that will become solidified. So I think that these are two things that I took away, and I don't think it contradicts what either one has said, but sort of reinforces that. But Bonnie, let me give you an opportunity to.
Thanks. I'll be brief, and thanks, Mike, for your terrific comments. I just want to pick up on, respond to one and pick up on one additional one. It's obvious that the real challenge in discussing CBMs between the two sides is that they really face an asymmetrical threat. China looks at Taiwan and is concerned about the danger of Taiwan moving away from the mainland and toward independence. Taiwan faces the real military threat, not the mainland. So this is a very different problem than CBMs that are pursued, for example, between India and Pakistan, which both have similar kinds of missiles and both have nuclear weapons. So this is a real challenge, I think. And so coming up with CBMs that work for both sides, that are symmetrical, in some ways can be difficult. The transparency things, I think, are easier. But when you raise things like military exercises, I think Mike's point is exactly right, that Taiwan should not be modifying its military exercises in any way that would affect its readiness and its plans to further develop interoperability and jointness, for example. So I would agree with that. Secondly, I spoke earlier about Taiwan's concern that conditions be created, favorable conditions for engaging in this dialogue about CBMs with the mainland. And one of the things that we heard stressed to us when we were in Taiwan is that there is a real need for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship to not only be strong in order for the Ma Ying-jeou government to sustain negotiations with the mainland, but also to be seen by the Taiwan populace as strong. There are many things that take place in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship that are not very visible. Our security and military relationship is not well known, although I would argue that it is very robust. But when Ma Ying-jeou first came to power, in his first 8 or 9 months in power, his near-term priority was to ease tensions with the mainland. And his main message to Washington at that time was, I will not be like my predecessor. I don't want to be a troublemaker. And really did not make demands on the United States to do things. Increasingly, there has been criticism domestically in Taiwan that Ma Ying-jeou has done so much with the mainland that he's seen as tilting toward the mainland. Now, I don't think this is necessarily the case, but it is the perception in Taiwan. And so Ma Ying-jeou's government is increasingly looking for the United States to do more, to take visible steps to strengthen the relationship so that it can be seen as strong in the eyes of the Taiwan public. And the kinds of things Mike has already referred to, not just arms sales, but also a possible cabinet secretary visit, doing more in the economic front, going beyond TIFA, for example. And so this is one thing that we heard from Taiwan officials as well as scholars that they hope will be done to create the kind of conditions so that the government in Taipei can sustain the dialogue with the mainland, and eventually, if conditions are right, to engage in a conversation about military confidence-building measures.
Good. Let's go ahead now and we'll open the floor up for questions and comments. I would ask you to identify yourself and try not to make your question longer than our presentations were. Chris, I saw your hand up first, and then this gentleman.